Jake Morrison stood in the center of the largest room he had ever seen, and his hands were shaking just a little bit, though he tried hard not to show it, because this was the moment that would decide everything for Earth and for humanity and for every person back home who was watching and hoping and praying that things would go well. The Galactic Tribunal chamber stretched out in all directions like a massive crystal cave that someone had carved from a frozen star, and the walls glowed with soft blue light that made everything feel cold and distant and unwelcoming. And Jake could see his reflection in the polished floor beneath his feet, looking small and insignificant compared to the towering aliens who sat in their high seats all around him, judging his entire species with their strange eyes and their stranger minds. Linda Hayes stood to his right with her diplomatic tablet clutched tight in her hands, and her face set in that calm expression she always wore when she was actually terrified inside. And on his left was Raymond Cole, who kept adjusting his engineer uniform like he wished he could disappear into the technical specifications of the building, instead of standing here being stared at by creatures that looked like they stepped out of nightmares and dreams all mixed together. The Krell ambassador rose from his seat, and Jake had to tilt his head back to see the massive reptilian face with its rows of sharp teeth and cold yellow eyes that seemed to look right through him like he was made of glass. The Krell spoken, a voice that rumbled like thunder, and the translation device in Jake's ear turned the sounds into words he could understand, but the meaning was clear enough without any translation, because the tone carried all the contempt and disgust that the Krell felt for humanity. They called humans violent and destructive, and showed holographic images of Earth's wars floating in the air above the tribunal floor, where everyone could see the bombs falling, and the cities burning, and the soldiers fighting in conflicts that seemed endless and pointless when viewed from the outside by species who claimed they had evolved beyond such things. Jake wanted to explain that humanity had been working hard to move past those wars, and that they had achieved decades of relative peace, and that they were trying to be better. But the tribunal did not seem interested in listening to explanations, or context, or any of the reasons why things had happened the way they did. The Vrix Collective came next, and their spokesbeings were small insectoid creatures that moved together like they shared one mind spread across a dozen bodies. And they showed footage of human sports where people hit each other and competed and fought for prizes and glory. And the Vrix said this proved that humans were inherently aggressive and unsuited for civilized society, because what kind of species entertains itself with violence and calls it recreation? Linda tried to interject and explain that sports were controlled and consensual, and actually helped reduce real violence by giving people an outlet. But her words were drowned out by the chittering dismissal of the Vrix, who had already made up their minds about what humanity was and what humanity would always be. Then came the Lunari, who were the strangest of all because they looked almost like humans, except their skin glowed with a faint inner light, and their eyes were too large and too knowing, and they spoke in voices that sounded like music, and made Jake feel homesick for reasons he could not explain. The Lunari were supposed to be the wise ones and the empathetic ones, but even they stood against humanity and talked about how humans had only been in space for a few centuries, which was nothing compared to the millennia that other species had spent exploring the stars, and they said humans were rushing into the galaxy too fast and too recklessly, without proper understanding of what they were doing, or what responsibilities came with traveling between worlds. Raymond muttered something under his breath about how you learn by doing and not by sitting around waiting for permission. But Jake shushed him because arguing would only make things worse, and things were already pretty bad. The debate went on for hours, and Jake spoke when he was allowed to speak, and Linda presented carefully prepared arguments about human progress and potential, and Raymond provided technical data showing Earth's scientific achievements and peaceful space missions. But nothing seemed to matter because the tribunal had already decided, and they were just going through the motions of appearing fair, while really they had made up their minds before the hearing even started. Jake could see it in the way they looked at him and in the way they dismissed his words, and in the way they whispered to each other in languages the translation device could not capture. When the verdict finally came, it was exactly what Jake had feared but had hoped against, and the head judge announced in a voice that echoed through the crystal chamber that humanity was denied membership in the Galactic Coalition and would be restricted to their home system until such time as they proved themselves capable of civilized behavior, which might be never because some species never evolved beyond their savage nature. Jake felt his heart sink, and Linda made a small sound like she had been punched in the stomach, and Raymond's face went red with anger that he barely held back. And Jake knew that billions of people back on Earth were watching this broadcast and feeling the same crushing disappointment and humiliation that came from being rejected by the galactic community and told they were not good enough to join the civilization of the stars. But before Jake could even begin to process what this meant or what they would do next, an alarm started blaring through the tribunal chamber, and the lights shifted from blue to red, and suddenly everyone was moving and talking at once in a chaos of different languages and concerns. A distress signal had arrived from somewhere in the Thesia system, and the automated emergency protocols had interrupted the tribunal session because galactic law required that all distress calls be answered immediately, no matter what else was happening. The holographic displays shifted to show a planet that Jake had never heard of called Thesia Prime, and the images were horrifying because he could see the massive crater where an asteroid had struck the northern hemisphere and the spreading fires and the collapsing cities and the millions of small dots that represented people who were dying right now while everyone watched. The Thessian ambassador was a small, gentle creature with soft fur and large, frightened eyes, and she was begging the tribunal for help because her people had no military and no heavy industry and no way to save themselves from the ecological collapse that would kill everyone on the planet within months if something was not done soon. The tribunal convened an emergency session, and Jake watched with growing disbelief as species after species stood up to express sympathy and concern, but offered nothing concrete to actually help. And the Krell said they would pray for the Thessians, and the Vrix suggested evacuation plans that would take years to implement, and the Lunari proposed forming a study committee to learn from the disaster so it could be prevented in the future. But none of them were actually going to do anything to save the millions of people who were dying right now in this moment. Jake looked at Linda, and Linda looked at Raymond, and they all had the same thought at the same time because sometimes humans were impulsive and reckless and did not think things through properly, but sometimes that meant they acted when others only talked. Jake pulled out his communication device and sent an encrypted message to Earth that said 3 simple words that would change everything. And those words were, "We are going." 3 weeks passed in a blur of frantic preparation and political arguments and desperate logistics planning. And then the human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Thesia system with a flash of displaced energy that lit up every sensor for 1,000,000 kilometers in every direction. And Captain Helen Foster stood on the bridge of the flagship Unity watching the tactical display show 15 massive cargo vessels and 5 hospital ships and a dozen construction platforms all arranged in perfect formation behind her ship, like a statement of intent that could not be ignored or dismissed. The Galactic Tribunal ships that were still orbiting Thesia Prime immediately began broadcasting warnings and complaints and legal objections because humans were not supposed to be here and were not supposed to be operating outside their restricted system. But Helen had her orders from Earth, and those orders were very clear about what mattered more than galactic politics and bureaucratic rules. Jake Morrison was on the Unity's bridge too because he had refused to go home after the tribunal rejection and had instead stayed in space waiting for this moment. And now he was ready with the legal arguments that Earth's best lawyers had spent 3 weeks crafting from every loophole and technicality they could find in the Coalition's laws. He broadcast his response on all frequencies so everyone could hear, including the billions of people across the galaxy who were watching this confrontation because the distress call from Thesia Prime had become the biggest news story in galactic history, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Jake explained in his calmest voice that the tribunal had restricted humanity from membership and from colonization, but had said nothing about humanitarian assistance, and he pointed out that galactic law actually required member species to render aid to distressed populations, and since humans were trying to join the galactic community, it made sense that they would follow those same principles, even if they had been rejected. It was a thin argument, and everyone knew it was a thin argument, but it was just barely good enough to make the Krell hesitate before they started shooting. And that hesitation was all Helen needed to begin operations. The fleet moved into orbit around Thesia Prime, and Helen coordinated with her ship captains to begin the largest relief operation humanity had ever attempted on an alien world. Raymond Cole led the first shuttle down to the surface with a team of engineers who had volunteered to go first, despite not knowing what they would find or whether the Thessians would even accept their help. And when Raymond's shuttle touched down in what used to be the capital city, he stepped out into a nightmare of destruction that made his hands clench into fists because he had seen disaster footage before, but seeing it in person was completely different. The city stretched out in all directions as nothing but rubble and twisted metal and broken buildings that had collapsed on the people inside them. And the air was thick with dust that made it hard to breathe, and the sky was dark even though it was supposed to be midday because the asteroid impact had thrown so much debris into the atmosphere that sunlight could barely get through. The Thessians who survived were hiding in emergency shelters that were never designed to hold so many people for so long, and they were running out of food and water and medical supplies and hope. And when they saw humans approaching in their strange suits and carrying their unfamiliar equipment, many of the Thessians were frightened because the last thing they had heard about humans was that the tribunal had called them savages and denied them membership for being too violent and dangerous. But Raymond and his team did not act like savages because they immediately started setting up equipment and scanning for survivors and organizing rescue operations with a calm efficiency that came from training and practice and a deep belief that helping people was just what you did when people needed help. Raymond found a Thessian engineer named Kellen, who had been trying to coordinate rescue efforts with almost no resources and was close to breaking down from exhaustion and despair. And Raymond sat down with Kellen and asked what was needed most urgently, and then got on his communicator and made it happen because the human fleet had brought supplies and equipment that Earth had scraped together from every available source, even though it had cost a fortune that Earth really could not afford. Dr. Sophie Martin arrived on the second wave of shuttles with the medical teams, and she set up field hospitals and structures that her people assembled in hours using prefabricated sections that locked together like enormous building blocks. Sophie had specialized in emergency medicine and had worked in disaster zones on Earth, where she had seen terrible things and learned how to keep working even when everything seemed hopeless. But treating aliens was a completely new challenge because Thessian biology was different from human biology in ways that made standard procedures dangerous or useless. She worked closely with the few Thessian doctors who had survived, and together they figured out how to adapt human medical techniques to Thessian patients through trial and error and desperate experimentation. And there were failures that kept Sophie awake at night, but there were also successes that made everything worthwhile. Nurse Chris Palmer became something of a legend when he successfully performed surgery on a young Thessian child who had been trapped under rubble for 2 days and who every Thessian doctor said could not be saved. But Chris refused to give up and worked for 6 straight hours until the child was stable and breathing on her own. And when the child's parents hugged Chris and cried tears of gratitude that looked just like human tears, he understood why they had come all this way. Captain Helen Foster stayed in orbit coordinating everything and dealing with the constant stream of complaints from the Galactic Tribunal, who kept insisting that humans should leave and let proper coalition species handle the relief efforts, except no proper coalition species were actually doing anything except watching and criticizing. Helen quickly learned that the Thessians' biggest problem was not just the immediate destruction but the long-term survival, because the asteroid impact had triggered volcanic eruptions that were pumping ash into the atmosphere and blocking out the sun. And without sunlight, the crops were dying across the entire planet, and millions more would starve even if they survived the initial disaster. She sent an urgent request to Earth for agricultural support, and Earth responded by sending Danny Warren, who was one of the best agricultural scientists humanity had and who brought with him seeds and equipment and ideas that had been developed during Earth's own environmental crises when people had to figure out how to grow food in impossible conditions. Danny took one look at the dying fields and the darkened sky and knew that traditional farming was finished on Thessia Prime for at least a decade, but he also knew that humans had invented alternative methods out of necessity and desperation and stubbornness. He started building underground farms using hydroponic systems that did not need sunlight and could produce food efficiently in controlled environments. And he taught Thessian farmers how to operate the systems and maintain them and expand them. The work was exhausting, and the scale was enormous because they needed to feed millions of people. But Danny and his team worked 20-hour days without complaining because they knew that every day of delay meant more people would go hungry. The Galactic Tribunal kept watching and kept waiting for humans to fail, or give up or demand payment for their help. But none of those things happened because the humans just kept working and kept building, and kept saving lives without asking for anything in return except maybe some gratitude and recognition that they were not the savages everyone claimed they were. After 2 months, Thessia Prime had functioning, hospitals treating thousands of patients and underground farms producing food for 3 million displaced citizens in temporary housing that was better than the emergency shelters and gave people some dignity and hope for the future. The Thessians began talking among themselves about these strange humans who had been rejected by the galaxy, but had come to help anyway, and they began to wonder if maybe the tribunal had been wrong about what made a species civilized. 4 months into the relief operation, the bill started coming due, and Earth's government began having very serious conversations about money and resources, and whether humanity could actually afford to keep helping Thessia Prime when their own people needed things and their own infrastructure needed investment, and their own future was uncertain after being rejected by the Galactic Coalition. The news broadcasts back on Earth showed politicians arguing in heated debates about the cost of compassion and whether it was right to spend billions of dollars on aliens, while human children still went hungry in some regions, and human cities still needed repairs, and human colonies in the solar system still struggled with basic supplies. Jake Morrison found himself on a quantum communication link, defending the mission to a panel of Earth's leaders who wanted answers about when the fleet would come home and what humanity was actually getting out of this enormous expenditure besides some good publicity that might not even matter if the galaxy still refused to accept them. Jake tried to explain that abandoning Thessia Prime now would waste everything they had already invested and would prove the tribunal right about humans being unreliable and selfish, but the counter-argument was that Earth could not be responsible for saving every species in trouble when they had not even figured out how to save themselves completely. The debate raged across Earth's communication networks, with some people calling the Thessia mission humanity's finest moment, and others calling it a foolish charity that would bankrupt the planet for the sake of aliens who would never appreciate the sacrifice. Jake felt the weight of every argument and every concern because they were all valid and all true, and he knew that if he could not convince Earth to keep supporting the mission, then millions of Thessians would die, and humanity's one chance at redemption would be lost forever. Meanwhile, on Thessia Prime, Raymond Cole was dealing with a crisis that made all the political arguments seem distant and irrelevant because the planet itself was dying in a way that underground farms could not fix. His seismic sensors were showing increased volcanic activity across 3 continents, and the computer models predicted that a supervolcano would erupt within 6 months and would cover the entire planet in ash so thick that even underground facilities would struggle to survive. Raymond spent 3 days running calculations and simulations and arguing with his team about possible solutions, and finally, he came up with a plan that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who you asked. They would drill down to the planet's mantle and install a network of thermal regulators that would redistribute the building pressure and prevent the catastrophic eruption. But the technology was experimental, and the conditions would be extreme, and the chances of success were maybe 60% at best, and the chances of survival for the drilling teams were even lower. Raymond called for volunteers and was overwhelmed when every single engineer on the planet raised their hand because they had all come to care about Thessia and about the people they were trying to save, and they all understood that running away from danger was not why they had joined this mission. Raymond selected the 3 best drilling specialists he had, including a young woman named Katie Brooks who was brilliant with machinery and fearless in a way that reminded Raymond of himself when he was younger, and together they began the most dangerous engineering project any of them had ever attempted. The drills went down through solid rock and then through layers of compressed minerals, and then through temperatures that would melt steel, and the team worked in shifts inside shielded pods that barely protected them from the crushing pressure and searing heat. Katie found herself 3 kilometers underground monitoring equipment that kept threatening to fail, while the rock around her groaned and shifted like a living thing that did not want them there, and she thought about her family back on Earth, who had begged her not to go on this mission and wondered if they had been right to worry. Dr. Sophie Martin was fighting her own battle against an enemy she could not see or touch, because a plague had started spreading through the refugee camps and was killing Thessians faster than her medical teams could treat them. The disease had jumped from some native animal that had been displaced by the disaster, and it was mutating rapidly as it spread through the population, and Thessian immune systems had no defense against it. because they had never encountered anything like it. Before, Sophie worked day and night with a Thessian scientist named Elder Ven, who was old and wise and knew more about Thessian biology than anyone alive, and together they tried to develop a treatment by combining human medical knowledge with Thessian biochemistry in ways that had never been done before. The laboratory was a cramped, temporary structure that smelled like antiseptic and desperation, and Sophie's hands shook from exhaustion as she prepared the 100th test sample, hoping that this one would finally work when all the others had failed. Elder Ven watched Sophie work with eyes that had seen many things in a long life, and said quietly that he had never met any species that fought so hard for people who were not their own. And Sophie replied without looking up that maybe fighting for others was what made you truly alive, because sitting back and doing nothing was really just a slow kind of death. The treatment finally worked on the 107th attempt, and they began producing it in quantities large enough to save thousands of lives. But Sophie knew that for every person they saved, there had been 10 they could not reach in time, and that knowledge sat heavy in her chest like a stone she would carry forever. Katie Brooks formed a special connection with a Thessian family she had pulled from collapsed rubble during the first week of operations, and she started visiting them whenever she had a few hours off from her engineering work, because there was something comforting about sitting with people who were grateful just to be alive, and who did not care about galactic politics or species differences. The family taught Katie their language, which sounded like wind chimes mixed with humming, and Katie taught them English, which they found impossible to pronounce properly but tried anyway, because it made Katie laugh. The youngest child drew pictures of Katie in her engineering suit and called her the metal angel who had saved them from the darkness, and Katie kept those drawings folded in her pocket when she went down into the deep drilling sites because they reminded her why the danger was worth it. The Galactic Tribunal continued their observation, and some species started questioning whether they had judged humanity too harshly, because the evidence was difficult to ignore when human workers were collapsing from exhaustion and human resources were being poured into Thessia without any obvious benefit to Earth. The Lunari sent a small medical team claiming they wanted to study human techniques, but really they came because they felt guilty about doing nothing while humans did everything, and their presence was a tiny crack in the wall of galactic indifference. Captain Helen Foster received intelligence that made her blood run cold, because apparently the Krell were lobbying for a vote to forcibly remove the human fleet and were arguing that humanity's presence violated the spirit of their restriction, even if it did not violate the letter of the law. And if the vote passed, then coalition warships would be authorized to fire on human vessels if they refused to withdraw. Jake Morrison received this news while he was still arguing with Earth's government about funding, and he realized that the mission now faced enemies on 2 fronts. He had to convince Earth to keep supporting them while also preparing for the possibility that the Galactic Coalition would attack them for the crime of helping people who needed help. And the absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it was not so terrifying. Jake made his decision in a moment of clarity that felt like jumping off a cliff, and he sent a message to Captain Foster that said they would stay and complete the mission regardless of what the tribunal decided, because some things mattered, more than safety or politics or even survival, and sometimes you had to stand for what was right even when the whole galaxy was standing against you. The deadline arrived like a storm that everyone had seen coming, but hoped would somehow change direction at the last moment, and Captain Helen Foster watched her tactical display show the Coalition enforcement fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system with enough firepower to turn her entire relief operation into debris floating in space. Commander Varric of the Krell led the fleet from his massive warship that looked like it had been designed specifically to intimidate anyone who saw it, and his broadcast message was cold and formal and left no room for negotiation when he stated that human vessels had 12 hours to withdraw from Thessia Prime or be destroyed for violating Coalition authority. Helen's hands were steady on her command console, but her heart was racing because she knew that Earth's fleet could not win a fight against the Krell and their allies, and she also knew that she had no intention of leaving no matter what threats were made against her. She ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate on the transport ships that could make it back to Earth before the shooting started, but when she made the announcement, nearly 70% of her crews volunteered to stay because they had invested too much and sacrificed too much and cared too much to abandon the mission now when they were so close to finishing. Raymond Cole and his drilling team were deep underground installing the final thermal regulators in a tunnel that was so hot, the air itself seemed to shimmer, and Katie Brooks refused to leave even when Raymond ordered her to go, because she said someone needed to watch his back and make sure he did not do anything stupidly heroic. Dr. Sophie Martin was in her field hospital with 200 patients who could not be moved without killing them, and when her staff asked if she was evacuating, she just laughed and said she had not saved these people just to let them die because some politicians with guns decided to throw their weight around. Jake Morrison was on the surface at the main refugee camp when the deadline was announced, and he watched Thessian families huddle together in fear because they understood enough to know that the humans who had saved them were now in danger because of that choice. Elder Venn found Jake standing alone looking up at the sky where somewhere far above deadly ships were preparing to fire. And the old Thessian scientist asked Jake why humans were willing to die for people they had only known for a few months. And Jake tried to explain that humanity had spent most of their history fighting each other until they finally learned that the only thing that really mattered was standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Elder Venn considered this for a long moment and then said she wanted to do something that might help, or might do nothing, but at least she would have tried. And before Jake could ask what, she meant she was already walking toward the communication center with a determination that made her seem taller than her small frame. Suggested Elder Venn recorded a message and broadcast it on every channel that reached the Galactic Coalition, and her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of someone who had lived long enough to see through lies and politics to the truth underneath. She spoke about watching her world die and believing that death was inevitable until humans arrived and fought against the inevitable with stubborn determination. And she described human engineers working until they collapsed, and human doctors crying over patients they could not save, and human volunteers giving their own food to hungry Thessian children without being asked. She asked a question that was simple, but cut through all the complicated arguments like a knife through silk. And the question was, what kind of civilization calls those who save live savages while doing nothing themselves except judge and condemn and watch from a safe distance? Her message spread across the galactic communication networks faster than anyone expected, because people from 100 different worlds heard it and shared it and talked about it. And suddenly the tribunal's decision to threaten the human fleet did not look like enforcement of rules, but looked like punishment for making the rest of the galaxy feel ashamed. Thessians recorded their own messages showing human workers exhausted and injured, but still working, and they showed the underground farms that were producing food, and the hospitals that were saving lives, and the housing that gave people dignity, and they asked why these actions deserved military force instead of gratitude. The response from across the galaxy was not universal, but it was significant enough to matter, and species that had been silent started speaking up and questioning whether the coalition's priorities were really about civilization or just about maintaining power and comfortable inaction. The Vrix Collective analyzed the data, because that was what they did with everything, and they calculated that humanity's resource expenditure on Thessia Prime exceeded any possible benefit to Earth by factors that made exploitation economically impossible, and they published their findings with the conclusion that humans were acting on genuine altruism, which was a concept the Vrix found mathematically fascinating, even if they did not fully understand it emotionally. The Lunari delegation released their own report based on months of observation, and they wrote about humans sharing meals with Thessians and learning their songs and mourning their dead, with the same grief they would show for their own kind. And the Lunari declared publicly that they had been wrong about humanity, and that being wrong was not shameful, but refusing to admit it would. Ships started arriving from different species, without any official authorization, and they were civilian vessels crewed by volunteers who had watched the broadcasts and decided that sitting at home judging others was not the kind of person they wanted to be. The Lunari sent medical supplies that Captain Helen Foster distributed to Dr. Martin's hospitals, and the Vrix sent construction drones to help with the rebuilding efforts. And even some younger Krell arrived with food shipments in defiance of their own government's orders, because they had been inspired by the human example. Commander Varric found himself in an impossible position, because his orders were to fire on the human fleet. But now there were ships from dozens of coalition species mixed in with the humans, and firing on humans meant also hitting coalition civilians, which would create a political disaster that would destroy his career and possibly start a civil war within the coalition itself. Down below the surface, Raymond Cole and his team installed the last thermal regulator 3 kilometers beneath Thessia Prime's crust, and the activation sequence began with a hum that Katie could feel in her bones through the shielded walls of their drilling pod. The sensors showed pressure readings dropping across the entire network as heat was redistributed away from the critical points that would have caused the supervolcano eruption. And Raymond let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like days as the system stabilized and proved that desperate engineering and human stubbornness could sometimes achieve the impossible. The success was broadcast immediately to everyone in the system and across the galaxy, and suddenly the conversation was not about whether humans should leave, but about the fact that they had actually succeeded in saving an entire planet when no one else had even tried. Commander Varric received new orders from the Krell High Council, and Jake could imagine the furious debates that must have happened before those orders were written, and the orders stated that the enforcement fleet would withdraw without engaging human vessels because the political situation had changed too much to make violence practical or wise. Varric's warship turned away from Thessia Prime and jumped to faster-than-light travel, followed by the rest of the enforcement fleet, and Helen Foster watched them go with relief so intense it made her dizzy. The human mission was complete, and Thessia Prime would survive, and humanity had proven something important, even if they were not quite sure what would happen next. 6 months after the first human ships had arrived at Thessia Prime, the planet held a celebration that brought together thousands of Thessians and hundreds of humans in the largest public square that had been rebuilt from the rubble of the old capital city, and the sky was beginning to clear as the volcanic ash settled in actual sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in half a year, making everyone stop and stare upward. At the simple miracle of a bright day, Raymond Cole stood with Kellen, the Thessian engineer, who had become his closest friend during the crisis, and they watched children playing in the square, including the young girl that Chris Palmer had saved, who was running and laughing like the injury and the fear had never happened. Katie Brooks was there with her adopted Thessian family, who had insisted she wear traditional Thessian ceremonial robes that looked strange on her human frame but meant more to her than anything she had ever worn before, and the youngest child held her hand and showed her drawings to everyone who passed by while explaining, in broken English, that this was their metal angel who had come from the stars, Dr. Sophie. Martin sat quietly at the edge of the celebration with Elder Ven, and they did not talk much, because they had spent so many hours working together that words were not always necessary, and they both carried the memories of patients they could not save, alongside the joy of those they could. The Lunari medical team that had arrived during the crisis had stayed to help, and were now teaching Thessian doctors advanced techniques while learning Thessian approaches to healing that emphasized community support and emotional care in ways the Lunari found beautiful and wise. Captain Helen Foster watched everything from the Unity still in orbit, because someone needed to coordinate the ongoing supply runs and the gradual transition of operations from human control to Thessian management, and she felt satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with military victories or strategic advantages, and everything to do with knowing that her crew had done something that actually mattered. The Galactic Tribunal convened another session, and Jake Morrison stood before them again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different because he was not alone and not asking for acceptance. Elder Ven stood beside him along with a delegation of Thessians who wanted to speak on humanity's behalf, and representatives from the Lunari were there too, along with some Vricks and even a handful of young Krell who had defied their elders to support the humans. The debate was intense and passionate, with the older Krell still arguing that humanity was dangerous and unpredictable and should not be trusted regardless of what they had done on Thessia Prime, but their voices were now the minority in a chamber that had been forced to reconsider what civilization actually meant. The Lunari ambassador rose to speak, and her voice filled the crystal chamber with words that Jake knew would be quoted for generations because they captured something fundamental about the choice every species faces between comfort and compassion. She spoke about how judging species by their past alone ignored their capacity for growth and change, and she pointed to humanity as proof that what mattered was not where you came from, but what you chose to do when the moment came to show who you really were. She argued that civilization was not about having the best technology or the longest history of peace, but about choosing to help when helping was hard, and choosing to stand up when standing up cost you something real and precious. The Vrix presented their analysis showing that humanity's actions on Thessia Prime could not be explained by selfishness or strategy or any calculation of benefit, and they stated that altruism was not just a human trait, but was perhaps the most important trait for any species that wanted to call themselves truly civilized. Jake Morrison stood to speak and propose something different from what anyone expected, because he was not asking for full membership anymore, but rather suggesting a new category within the Galactic Coalition that he called provisional partners. Species in this category would have limited voting rights and could not colonize new worlds without oversight, but they could participate in humanitarian operations and cultural exchanges, and would have the chance to prove themselves over time through actions rather than words. It was a compromise that acknowledged humanity's rough edges while recognizing their potential, and it gave other species a way to accept humans without having to admit they had been completely wrong in their initial judgment. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity and practical in its implementation, and Jake could see delegates conferring with their governments and calculating whether this middle path was acceptable to their constituencies. The vote was called, and the tension in the chamber was thick enough to cut, because everyone understood that this moment would define how the galaxy viewed not just humanity but the entire concept of what species deserved a chance at the stars. The votes came in one by one, with each species announcing their decision publicly, and Jake watched the tally climb slowly toward the number needed for passage, while Linda Hayes gripped his arm tight enough to leave marks. The Lunari voted yes immediately, and the Vrix voted yes after a long deliberation, and the Krell were divided, with the younger members voting yes while the Old Guard voted no, and dozens of smaller species that had been silent throughout the entire crisis voted yes, because they looked at humanity's sacrifice and saw something they wanted their own people to aspire toward. When the final tally was announced, Jake felt Linda collapse against him with relief, while Raymond let out a whoop that echoed through the chamber, and humanity had been granted provisional partner status, which was not everything, but was definitely something, and was more importantly, a beginning. 1 year later, Captain Helen Foster commanded a joint human Thessian relief mission to a Vrix colony world that had suffered catastrophic flooding, and she worked alongside Kellen, who had become an expert in rapid response construction, and who taught Vrix engineers techniques he had learned from humans during their darkest hours. Raymond Cole was training coalition engineers at a new academy, established specifically to teach disaster response and emergency infrastructure, and his classes were always full because everyone wanted to learn from the species that had turned impossible situations into success stories. Dr. Sophie Martin taught cross-species medicine at the Galactic Medical Institute and collaborated with researchers from a dozen different species to develop treatments that worked across biological types, and Elder Venn co-taught many of her classes, bringing wisdom that complemented Sophie's practical experience. Katie Brooks had chosen to stay on Thessia Prime permanently because the planet had become her home in ways Earth never quite had, and she worked on long-term rebuilding projects while living with her adopted family and teaching young Thessians about engineering and showing them that technology was not about power but about solving problems and helping people. Jake Morrison served as Earth's permanent ambassador to the Galactic Coalition and found himself mediating disputes between species who had once looked down on humanity, but now asked for his perspective and valued his input. He stood often at the observation deck of the Tribunal station, looking out at the stars and thinking about how far humanity had come from being called savages to being asked for advice on how to build a better civilization. The Galactic Tribunal developed a new standard for evaluating species that applied for membership, and the test was no longer just about technology or peace within borders, but about what a species did when others were suffering. The Lunari ambassador had captured it perfectly in a question that became the measuring stick for civilization. And that question was simple and profound, and changed everything about how the galaxy thought about itself. When disaster strikes, will they help or will they simply watch? And the answer to that question mattered more than weapons or ships or millennia of recorded history, because compassion was the thing that separated true civilization from elaborate barbarism. Humanity had been called savages, and had been rejected and had been threatened with destruction, but they had chosen to be saviors instead and had earned something more valuable than membership, which was respect and friendship and the knowledge that they had changed the galaxy by refusing to accept that watching was enough when action was possible.